countries who joined the EU with you, like Poland, for example, which has strong growth and, at the moment, a relatively positive economic outlook. Do you wish that, like Poland, you'd stayed out of the euro a bit longer?
No, this is only a kind of a hypothetical thinking.
Of course it is, but I'm sure many Slovenians are pondering it as they look at the bill that may well be coming their way for bailing out other European countries.
Well, not really. I mean, in the political reality, this is not our situation. But, of course, hypothetically and in the academic circles, one can make these comparisons. One also have to understand the following. Poland is much larger. Poland is a market of 40 million consumers. They can rely on an internal market which is stronger, which is larger. And then also they have had their tax reforms in the past which strengthened the demand. So that was advantageous to Poland. And of course they could devalue their currency in the process.
Which you can't, of course.
Which we could not. Now these are all advantages which we have seen and which were discussed in a slightly more academic fashion. But in terms of real policy making, they didn't have any impact.
Let's stick with this idea of the impact that the eastward expansion of the European Union has had on the Union as a whole. Do you accept that as we look at some of the complications that now arise, for example, with the EU's consideration for membership of some of the other Balkan states, that there is a real difficulty, there's a lack of coherence when one considers the sorts of countries that want to come in and the attitudes that the existing members bring to those countries? Do you see a lack of coherence?
Well, certainly the level of coherence is not perfect. I mean, it hasn't been perfect in 2004 when the current group of new members came in, and it's not coherent now when one talks about new candidate countries. What is interesting, however, is the growing understanding that the criteria for admission have to be taken seriously. So, for example, in the negotiations with Croatia, we see that all the criteria for membership are really very seriously taken.
Well, up to a point, although you know very well, much better than me, that Slovenia, your country, has a border dispute which continues with Croatia. You've agreed to sort of kick it into the long grass. It's going to go to arbitration.
Yes.
But can you seriously imagine Croatia being admitted to the EU as it wants to be in 2013, with you having an unresolved, and to your public at least, a very important border dispute that continues?
The answer is yes, because our agreement, the arbitration agreement, provides for a system which will be put in place after the signature of the accession agreement. So only then the arbitration will be put together and the process of conflict, that is this dispute resolution, will take place.
Well, you sound very reasonable about it, and you're a former diplomat, so I can understand the tact you bring to this, but you know as well as I do, there are significant politicians in your parliament who say that the parliament in the end must ratify the enlargement treaty which will be applied to Croatia, and they say it can only happen with a two-thirds majority, and they're going to try and block it. So, frankly, Croatia may well fall at the hurdle of Slovenia's parliament.
Well, the answer to this is that we have had a referendum, that the arbitration agreement was supported by the population in a referendum, and that will be a very strong argument at all later stages.
Well, talking then of things that remain unresolved, Serbia is a country that matters to you.
Correct.
You don't need a long memory to remember the difficulties you had in Slovenia, seceding, breaking away from the former Yugoslavia. Your relations with Belgrade have been sensitive since. And here we have the European Commission now actively considering Serbia's bid for membership. Do you think it is even remotely acceptable to imagine Serbia as a member of the European Union when, for example, Ratko Mladic is still at large, and when, for example, Serbia refuses to recognize the independence of Kosovo?
Well, in general, the answer is yes, of course. We can see Serbia as a member of the European Union, and we are actually actively supporting that process or that intention of Serbia. We also agree that conditions have to be fulfilled. I mean, among the criteria, one of them for Serbia is cooperation with the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, and that, yes, includes the handing over of Ratko Mladic for trial. And that will have to happen at some point in the process towards membership.
And you're an active supporter of the independence of Kosovo. You've recognized the state. You also see the Serbs still with a major presence in northern Kosovo, telling the ethnic Serb people in northern Kosovo not to participate in the December Kosovar election. I come back to the point. Does it really make sense to be actively discussing Serbia's membership of the European Union, given these very difficult issues that remain unresolved?
Well, you know, one has to work on two tracks. One is membership, the other is Kosovo talks. I mean, as you know, there has been an agreement between all concerned, including the European Union, that Belgrade and Pristina should talk. Preparations are in place. European Union is going to mediate, and I'm sure that over time this can be dealt with successfully.
It's a lot to deal with, isn't there? And it strikes me as not just even the European Union. You're now a proud member of NATO as well. But this question, this theme I'm developing of incoherence, it applies to NATO as well. I mean, let's start at the beginning.
Well, politics is not coherent. I mean, politics is rather
complex. One likes to think
complex.
that there is some consistency and some sort of thematic sense to political decision-making.
Correct.
Well, good, thank you. Well, let's examine it then in the context of NATO. We know, and it was expressed very well recently by the US Defense Secretary, Robert Gates, that in Washington there's a real concern that there are now so many European members of NATO, and many of them are simply not prepared to modernize their militaries and pay for their militaries to a point where they can be effective and useful partners in the North Atlantic Alliance. Is Slovenia one of those?
No. Slovenia is, I think, a responsible member of NATO. We are participating in NATO activities to the extent necessary.
Well, I think it would be worth telling people how much you're participating. I mean, how many men do you have in Afghanistan, for example?
We have in Afghanistan our contingent. We have an OMLT.
How
Statistically, this is, well, I mean, we have around 70 or 100 people.
Well, it's less than 100, isn't it?
That's a small number,
I mean,
but for a country of 2 million...
a fig leaf. It's a symbol, it's a token, it's not meaningful, is it?
Well, not really. I mean, if you take the statistical proportions, you would see that this is a decent number for the country of our size. And we don't pretend to have a major military impact, but we want to show our commitment to NATO, and we are there. We have an OMLT, and of course we are going to participate in discussions on the future of Afghanistan.
What proportion of your GDP, national income, do you spend on defense?
Currently it is about 1.8 or so.
So it's less than 2%?
It's less than 2%.
NATO and the United States in particular have said that every nation should spend much more than 2%, 2.5% to be credible as members of NATO.
Well, look, we have had to cut our defense spending in the time of budget austerity, and we have done so. But we are still above the level of many other NATO countries.
As I've said, the Americans regard that as part of the problem. There are far too many, may I say it, smaller members of NATO like yourselves who aren't prepared to take on board the responsibilities that come with membership.
Well, comparatively, we are in a fairly decent category.
There's another problem, if I may say so, and that is you don't seem to be on the same page as many other NATO members when it comes to Russia. You recently had a very cozy meeting with President Medvedev.
What's wrong with that?
Well, nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't seem that the message you came out of that meeting with bears much relation to that coming out of Washington when it comes to missile defense, for example.
Well, I think that's very coherent, and actually what happened in Lisbon 2 or 3 days later was very much in the same line.
Well,
I mean, that was cooperation between NATO and Russia for missile defense.
Yes, but, with respect, what the summit came up with was a decision simply to talk about it some more at the Russia-NATO Council.
Correct.
What you seem to be saying is that you believe that Russia must have a very significant role, maybe even a command and control role in some sectors of this missile defense shield, which is what the Russians are saying, but the Americans have rejected that.
So far, I think that cooperation will have to bring an appropriate pattern, and that would have to define a new relationship. I mean, it is wrong simply to assume that extrapolation of the current positions is going to be the solution. I think we have to talk, and that discussion has to produce a meaningful cooperation arrangement, which is not yet there, but which will have to give a proper voice to both sides.
Would it be fair to say, Mr. President, as a small nation, there is a great attraction to doing deals with Russia, not least because I believe the South Stream pipeline that they're building to bring Russian gas into southern Europe may will go through your territory. You're very delighted about that. It may give you a guaranteed energy supply, which will be very good for the Slovenian people. And because of all of that, you're prepared to jettison a few principles. Fair?
Not necessary. I mean, we don't have to jettison any principle whatsoever. I think the time has come for a new partnership between NATO and Russia. We may be among the ones who are saying this very clearly and at an early stage. But partnership for modernization is the key to the future of Europe.
Before we end, I just want to ask you a really big picture question. It
Yes.
seems to me in 2004 Slovenia chose to throw in its lot with
Yes.
Western Europe.
Yes.
You know, what Donald Rumsfeld used to call the old
Yes.
Europe. You were the new Europe. Your growth rates at the time were really very impressive across Eastern Europe,
Yes.
and still there's more potential arguably
Yes.
for growth in Eastern Europe than there is in Western Europe. Do you think, looking forward and looking at the way in which the whole sort of world economy is shifting eastward, that maybe you and other East European nations were too hasty to rush into the embrace of Western Europe? Maybe there were different ways you could have organized yourselves.
Well, that doesn't correspond to the way we see things in Slovenia. We believe that moving towards European Union was critically important for us. Becoming a member was a major achievement, and we don't share this kind of thought of Rudyard Kipling, East is East and West is West, and they will never meet. We think that East and West are changing, and the end of Cold War requires changes on both sides. And I believe that we are starting to see these changes happening. And I think that NATO-Russia partnership, EU-Russia partnership is a part of that process, which is still perhaps at its beginnings, but it is real and it is there. And we believe that East and West will be different in not too distant future.
President Danilo Tuerk, thank you very much indeed for being on HardTalk. Thank you.
My pleasure.